Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I knew something was off the moment I walked into the banquet hall. There was a thick, artificial warmth in the air, one of those overly decorated, overpriced hotel ballrooms that reeked of roses and resentment. Music played in the background, couples laughed in their little clusters, and waiters danced between tables with silver trays full of champagne flutes. People smiled like they actually gave a damn, but beneath all of it, I could feel it. That itch under the skin when something's just not right. I clutched my small black clutch tighter and scanned the place for my husband, Mark. He had gone ahead with his mother earlier, apparently to help with some last-minute arrangements. That was fine. I didn't mind walking in alone. I'd done far lonelier things in this family. The wedding was for his younger sister, Claire, 26, spoiled beyond belief, and the kind of woman who thought kindness was optional if you had enough highlighter on your cheekbones. But fine. I came with a smile on my face. I always did. That's what was expected of me. Be the quiet wife, the good wife, the polite ornament Mark brought along for appearances. I walked toward the seating chart, thinking I'd grab my card and take a breath before the usual parade of backhanded compliments began. I looked over the cards, eyes trailing across neat little names printed in glossy calligraphy. Mark was at table 1, of course, right next to his parents. My eyes kept scanning until I found it, a name card that made my heart drop in my chest. There it was. Lena, housekeeper. At first, I blinked, thinking it was some sort of sick joke. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe there was another Lena. Maybe someone had written that as a placeholder and forgot to change it. But no, my name was spelled right. The font matched. The placement was clear. And then I heard it, the high-pitched snort that gave it all away. Mark's mother was standing a few feet behind me, hands delicately clasped in front of her, lips curled into a smug little smile that made my stomach twist. "Well," she said, her voice coated in mock sweetness, "you're just a servant here anyway, aren't you?" I stared at her for a moment, my mouth dry. I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, not from shame, but from fury. Pure, slow-burning, cold fury. But I said nothing. I wasn't going to give her the pleasure of a scene. I turned toward the dining area, hoping this was some elaborate prank that would end there. But of course, it didn't. There was no seat for me at table 1. In fact, there was no seat for me anywhere. I searched for another table, checked and rechecked every damn card. I even asked one of the servers quietly if maybe there'd been a mistake in the arrangement. He checked with the coordinator. Came back shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am. You're not listed on any of the tables. Maybe check with the family?" Oh, I checked, all right. Claire, standing near the cake table in her designer dress, glowing and grinning like a prom queen, saw me and smirked. "Oh, you're still here," she said loud enough for a few heads to turn. "Sorry, Lena, food's only for real family." A few guests chuckled quietly. One even muttered something about in-laws and their drama, not even bothering to lower his voice. My throat tightened. My hands curled into fists so tight I could feel my nails biting into my palm. I looked over at Mark, standing across the room, laughing with one of his cousins, completely unaware of the humiliation happening just a few feet away. I could have yelled. I could have cried. But instead, I did something none of them expected. I reached up, took off my wedding ring, just gently, no drama, no flourish. I held it in my palm for a second, stared at it like it was some artifact from a past life I barely remembered anymore. Then I slipped it into my clutch, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the exit without looking back. The silence behind me was loud. Confused voices, shifting chairs, a glass clinking against a fork somewhere. It was the kind of silence that follows a storm, or maybe the one right before it. I was almost to the door when I heard it. Heels clicked quickly behind me. A sudden whisper, close to my ear, desperate and low. "Wait, please." It was my mother-in-law. Her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time in years, there was no smugness in her tone. But I didn't stop walking. I met Mark at a neighborhood cookout on a humid July afternoon, the kind where the air hangs heavy with the smell of grilled meat and sunscreen, and strangers talk like they've known each other for years simply because everyone's sweating together under the same sun. He wasn't flashy or loud, didn't try to impress with shallow charm or empty conversation. He stood quietly near the lemonade cooler, making awkward jokes about how he'd rather be in a bookstore than under a tent full of mosquitoes. There was something soft about him, something unassuming and kind, and after a few minutes of awkward small talk, I found myself laughing more than I expected. He wasn't the type to take up space, but he had a presence that stayed with you, gentle, warm, like the last bit of sunlight before dusk. We started seeing each other not long after that, slow and steady, the kind of relationship that builds without fireworks, but with solid ground beneath your feet. He listened more than he spoke, and I liked that. After years of dating men who treated conversations like competitions, Mark felt like a pause, a breath. But I should have known that quiet doesn't always mean strength. Sometimes silence is just fear dressed up as peace. It wasn't until I met his family that I realized how much of Mark's life had been shaped by avoidance. His mother, Eleanor, was polite in the way politicians are polite, her words always wrapped in lace, but stitched with barbs. She smiled too tightly, touched too coldly, and made me feel like I'd walked into a country club in dirty sneakers. From the first dinner at their house, I knew I didn't belong, not because I didn't try, but because they'd already decided I wasn't the kind of woman they had imagined for their golden boy. They didn't say it outright, of course. It was in the way she asked if my dress was off the rack or custom. In the way his father barely looked at me when I spoke, like he couldn't be bothered to register my presence unless I was pouring wine or clearing a plate. It was in the way Claire, even then just a college brat with credit cards and contempt, would laugh under her breath whenever I mentioned my job. Marketing wasn't glamorous enough for their crowd, I suppose, not when your last name mattered more than your resume. But I stayed quiet. I told myself it was just adjustment, that they'd soften with time. I convinced myself that love meant enduring discomfort, that biting your tongue was a small price to pay for building a life with someone. So I smiled through the dinners, through the passive-aggressive remarks, through the subtle digs wrapped in compliments. I stood beside Mark like a trophy I hadn't earned, waiting for his family to see me as more than a placeholder. What I didn't realize back then was that silence is the perfect soil for manipulation. Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. She used status like a blade, always just sharp enough to cut, never deep enough to bleed. She'd guilt Mark into hosting family brunches on weekends I'd planned for rest. She'd send me home decor books with notes like, "Thought your place could use a little sophistication." She'd offer to help with wedding plans, only to veto every decision I made with phrases like, "Well, in our family, we don't do things that way." And Mark, sweet, passive Mark, he'd just sigh and say, "She doesn't mean it like that," or worse, "It's easier if we just let her feel involved." He thought he was protecting me by smoothing over the tension, but all he was doing was feeding the fire. Every time he stayed silent, he handed her another match. Have you ever stayed quiet in a family just to keep peace? Ever smiled while swallowing your pride at someone else's dinner table, telling yourself it's not worth the argument, not worth the cold shoulder, not worth the look your partner gives you afterward? Tell me, how long is too long to be silent before your silence becomes complicity? Looking back, I wonder if Mark ever truly believed I was one of them, or if he always knew I was just a guest in their little kingdom, someone he brought home like a stray dog he hoped they'd eventually warm up to. Maybe he thought love would be enough to bridge the gap. Maybe I thought so too. But recently, there's been a memory crawling back into my mind, one I've pushed down for years. A small moment, barely noticeable at the time, but now it plays on a loop in my head. A whisper I wasn't supposed to hear, a look exchanged between Mark and Eleanor after a family dinner years ago, when I excused myself early and went upstairs. He had said something quiet, clipped, and she had replied, "You'll see. She'll never really belong here." And Mark? Mark didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He didn't defend me. He just nodded. Maybe he thought I'd never hear. Maybe he thought I'd never remember. But now, years later, I do. And I'm starting to wonder if the man I fell in love with ever truly stood on my side, or if he was just standing in the middle, hoping the storm would pass without getting wet. And if that's true, then maybe I've been sleeping next to the wrong kind of silence all along. The second I stepped back into the house, the silence almost felt too clean, too still, like the kind of silence that doesn't comfort you, it suffocates you. I stood just inside the doorway for a moment, fingers still curled around the clutch that now held my wedding ring like a dead thing, something hollow and meaningless that used to carry weight. I kicked off my heels without even thinking, let them fall sideways on the floor like discarded pieces of some woman I didn't recognize anymore, and I didn't even bother turning on the lights. I just walked into the dim living room, dropped onto the couch, and let my body go slack for the first time all night. That's when it started, the buzzing, relentless and sharp, like a swarm of angry bees trying to break through glass. My phone lit up over and over again, vibrating across the coffee table like it had a pulse of its own. First it was Mark. Then again. Then again. Then a call from Eleanor, which I ignored without even blinking. Then Claire. Then someone I didn't even recognize, probably one of the cousins who'd witnessed the entire thing and now wanted a front row seat to the fallout. I didn't answer a single one. I just sat there in the dark, staring at the glowing screen, watching name after name flash and disappear, feeling nothing and everything all at once. After the 10th missed call, the messages started rolling in. Where are you? Can we talk? Please pick up. This isn't what it looks like. Lena, please don't make this a bigger deal than it is. And there it was, in that one sentence. Don't make this a bigger deal than it is, the core of everything I'd endured for years. That subtle, manipulative way they all tried to shrink my pain, minimize my humiliation, rewrite the narrative until I became the difficult one for daring to feel something about being treated like dirt. I didn't need anyone to spell it out for me. I'd seen this movie too many times before. I stayed silent. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't throw anything or pour myself a drink. I just waited. I knew he'd come home eventually. I knew he'd walk through that door thinking he could fix this with some half-assed apology and a tired explanation, the way he always did. And right on cue, just after 11, I heard his key in the lock. The door creaked open, and he stepped in, looking disheveled, flushed, somewhere between embarrassed and panicked. Lena, he said softly, like he was trying not to wake a sleeping dog he'd just kicked. Can we talk? I didn't respond right away. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a man who was no longer unfamiliar, but no longer safe either. A man who had watched me sit through years of cold shoulders and biting comments and never once stood between me and the fire. He walked toward me, hands slightly raised like I was a skittish animal. I didn't know they were going to do that, he said quickly, voice breaking a little at the end. I swear, Lena. I had no idea about the name tag or the food. I thought you were sitting with me. Something got messed up. I raised an eyebrow but still didn't say anything. I just stared at him until his words started tripping over themselves. Claire, she probably thought it was funny. You know how she is. She doesn't think before she talks. That's when I stood up, slowly, and walked past him without a word. I went into the bedroom, opened his nightstand drawer, and pulled out his phone. He didn't notice at first, still fumbling through excuses in the living room, but when I returned and tossed it gently onto the coffee table, unlocked and opened to the messages, he finally stopped talking. He looked down, confused. What's this? I pointed at the screen, where the group chat was still open. I'd seen it days ago by accident. He'd left it open while brushing his teeth, and I'd caught just enough of the conversation to take a screenshot before he noticed. But I hadn't said anything then. I didn't want to believe it was what it looked like. But now, it was all right there in front of him, the thread between Eleanor and Claire, dated just a week before the wedding. Claire had sent a picture of me in a dress I'd worn to a previous dinner, captioned, "Hope the housekeeper wears something less tragic at my wedding." Eleanor replied, "Let her, makes it easier to seat her near the kitchen." Mark had responded with a laughing emoji. And there it was. Simple. Brutal. Undeniable. His face went pale. He reached for the phone like it might explain itself if he touched it again. Lena, that was just a stupid joke, I didn't mean. But I held up a hand to stop him, and this time, I finally spoke. You didn't know, right? That's what you said? You had no idea they treated me like this. No idea I was being humiliated in your name. But you knew. You knew weeks ago, and you laughed. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat back down, leaned forward, and stared at the ring still hidden in my clutch. I hadn't even put it back on, and suddenly I knew I never would. I didn't say another word that night, but my mind was already turning in silence, sharper than it had ever been. Because when someone shows you who they are, you can either keep pretending it's a mask, or you can start planning what to do next. The next morning, I woke up before the sun, not because I had slept well or felt refreshed, but because something inside me had snapped clean in half the night before, and I needed to move before the numbness turned into weakness. I sat on the edge of the bed, the same bed where Mark had slept beside me for years, and I realized how foreign it all felt now, the sheets, the air, the silence between us. He was still asleep, sprawled across the mattress like the weight of guilt hadn't even scratched his skin. I didn't bother waking him. There was nothing left to say that I hadn't already said with my silence. I went into the kitchen, made a cup of coffee so strong it tasted like defiance, and stared out the window for a long time. That's when it happened, not rage, not grief, not sorrow. What washed over me instead was clarity, like someone had lifted a heavy, thick curtain from my mind, and I could finally see my life as it was, not as I had convinced myself it might become someday. I had wasted too many years trying to be accepted by people who'd never wanted me to begin with, bent myself into polite shapes so they'd feel comfortable while I slowly disappeared. That same afternoon, I called a lawyer, not to file for divorce, at least not yet, but for something far more precise. I wanted a postnuptial agreement, ironclad and bulletproof, with every hour of unpaid labor, emotional sacrifice, and domestic management I had poured into this marriage accounted for in hard legal language. I wasn't going to leave empty-handed if things went south. I wasn't going to be the woman who gave up everything and walked away with nothing just because she trusted a man who laughed at jokes made at her expense. While I waited for the paperwork to be drafted, I pulled out my old laptop, the one gathering dust in the bottom drawer of my desk for years. The screen flickered to life like it had been waiting for me to return, and I opened my old email account. Dozens of unread messages from former clients, colleagues, contacts who once praised my work and wondered if I'd ever come back. I started responding, slowly at first, testing the waters like a woman trying to remember her own reflection. Within 2 weeks, I had 3 small projects on my plate. By the end of the month, I had a steady stream of freelance work, not flashy or world-changing, but mine, earned by my own brain, my own hands, my own goddamn name. Every morning, I worked at the dining table, headphones in, fingers flying across the keyboard. Mark would come in, see me working, and say nothing. He looked smaller somehow, muted, quieter than usual, like he didn't quite know where to stand in this new version of the house. And I let the silence stretch between us, not out of cruelty, but because it was the first time in years that I felt like the silence actually belonged to me. A week later, Eleanor showed up at the front door. I saw her through the peephole, standing there with a tray of muffins and a face full of fake contrition, like she thought a baked apology could erase the years she spent tearing me down. I didn't open the door. I didn't even knock back. I just watched her through the narrow glass until she eventually turned around and walked away, probably fuming, probably planning another manipulative phone call that I would never answer. Later that evening, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail, the kind of thick, pretentious stationery rich people use when they want to pretend they're royalty. Inside was a formal invitation to another wedding. Mark's other sister, Amanda, was getting married in 3 months, and this time, I was invited properly, with my full name printed in gold foil, a +1 included, a seat at the head family table. Even a handwritten note from Amanda herself saying she hoped I'd attend and that things between us would be different. I sat there for a long time, turning the invitation over in my hands, staring at the elegant script and the ridiculous RSVP card that probably cost more than my entire last paycheck. I smiled, not because I was touched, not because I believed anything had changed, but because in that moment, I already knew I wouldn't be showing up the way they expected. I was already planning something entirely different, something deliberate and sharp and unforgettable. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or public or cruel. It's quiet, calculated, and wrapped in velvet. And when it lands, it doesn't just sting, it echoes. By the time the second wedding rolled around, I was no longer the same woman who had quietly swallowed humiliation with a forced smile and a stiff spine. I had become something else entirely, sharper, calmer, more precise in my silence, more deliberate in my words. There was a kind of peace in no longer chasing approval, a strange and satisfying stillness that settled into my bones the moment I stopped giving a damn about being liked. I didn't need to be accepted anymore. I just needed to be seen, and not in the way they had always seen me, as something forgettable or disposable, but as something they'd never be able to ignore again. I arrived at the wedding alone, stepping out of the car in a tailored black silk dress that fit like armor, subtle but striking, the kind of outfit that didn't scream for attention but commanded it all the same. My hair was pinned back in a sleek twist, my makeup understated but flawless, and I walked into that hall like I had never once been treated like a ghost at their table. Heads turned. Eyes followed. A few mouths even hung slightly open, not because of what I was wearing, but because of how I carried it, like I didn't owe anyone in that room a damn explanation for who I had become. The hall was just as overdecorated as the last one, maybe even more so, glittering chandeliers, floral arrangements tall enough to block conversations, and a string quartet playing something soft and expensive in the background. I handed my invitation to the usher without a word and made my way to the seating chart. My name was right there at the top of table 1, printed in crisp black letters, no passive-aggressive titles, no sideways insults. Just my name. Amanda had made sure of that. I hadn't expected it, honestly. Amanda had always been quieter than Claire, more observant, less vicious in her snobbery. But after everything that had happened, she'd reached out with an apology that sounded almost genuine, and I decided to attend not because I believed in her sincerity, but because I wanted to see what it felt like to walk into their world on my terms, not theirs. When I reached the table, Eleanor's expression barely held together. She glanced up at me like she was hoping I'd vanish before the first course. Her eyes flicked to the empty seat beside her, clearly hoping I'd misread the chart. But I didn't even acknowledge her. I pulled the chair out with one elegant motion, smoothed my dress beneath me, and sat down like I owned the damn table. Mark was already seated across from me, watching quietly, his eyes unreadable. He didn't say a word, just lifted his glass slightly in greeting, and I offered the faintest nod in return. Dinner passed in a strange kind of silence, filled with awkward pleasantries and tight smiles, the air thick with tension none of them knew how to name. I played my part perfectly, polite, gracious, even warm in just the right doses, but every word I spoke carried an edge sharp enough to slice through the pretense they were all clinging to. And then came the toasts. The best man spoke first, followed by the maid of honor, both offering the usual blend of tired anecdotes and saccharine cliches. And then, without being asked, I stood. I hadn't told anyone I planned to speak, and for a second, the entire table froze, unsure whether to stop me or let it happen. But I held my glass high and began, my voice calm, steady, almost amused. To family, I said, letting the words hang just long enough to twist. The kind that teaches us exactly what not to become. The kind that reminds us that blood isn't a measure of kindness, and tradition isn't a license for cruelty. A few chuckles rippled through the table, nervous, unsure. I continued, smiling sweetly. To the ones who teach us how to survive their silence. To the ones who make us stronger by underestimating us. And to the ones who remind us, over and over again, that dignity is best served cold, with a smile. When I sat back down, the silence was deafening. Eleanor's face had gone rigid, her mouth pressed into a line so tight it looked like a scar. Mark stared at me like he was trying to figure out if he should be impressed or afraid. Amanda gave me the smallest nod across the table, a signal that told me she had heard every word for exactly what it was. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of stiff conversations and polite distance. I didn't stay long after dinner. I had no interest in pretending to dance with people who couldn't even look me in the eye 2 months ago. I collected my clutch, thanked Amanda with a quiet word, and made my way toward the exit. But just as I reached the outer hallway, I heard his voice behind me, quiet, desperate, that same broken softness he had used the night I walked out of Claire's wedding. "Lena," Mark said, catching up with me, his hand barely brushing my arm. "Can we talk?" I turned to face him slowly, measured, calm, no heat in my eyes, only a kind of heavy, tired stillness. "I'll talk," I said, voice steady, sharp, and final. "But this time, you're going to listen." We drove home in silence, the kind that stretches too far and grows too heavy, the kind that doesn't feel like a pause, but a boundary you can't walk across anymore without bruising your soul. Mark sat behind the wheel, gripping it a little too tight, eyes forward like he couldn't bear to look sideways, afraid that one glance would shatter whatever fragile hope he still carried inside him. I didn't speak, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was too tired of saying the same things to a man who only heard them when it was convenient for his guilt. I watched the streetlights blur across the windshield, one after another, soft flickers of light that reminded me just how long I'd been sitting in the dark for someone else's comfort. When we got home, I didn't wait for him. I walked inside first, kicked off my shoes the way I always had, hung my coat with slow, deliberate motions, and made my way to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, arms crossed, heart steady, breath calm. Mark followed me in a moment later, hovering near the doorway like a boy who'd broken something but wasn't sure how to fix it, unsure if he should speak or stay quiet, afraid either one would get him crushed. "I know I messed up," he finally said, voice low and hesitant, the words tumbling out like loose change in a cheap apology. "I know what I did, or didn't do, isn't something I can fix with a few words." I stayed silent, letting him feel the weight of his own guilt pressing down harder with every second. He rubbed the back of his neck like he always did when he was nervous, eyes searching mine for some sign of softness, some crack in the wall he could slip through. "I was scared," he continued, his voice almost breaking now. "Scared of standing up to my mom. Scared of starting fights. Scared you'd leave me if things got worse." I tilted my head slightly, eyes narrowing, not with anger, but something colder, something sharper than rage. "So you let me rot instead?" I asked, finally breaking the silence with a voice so even it sounded like it had been rehearsed. "You stood beside people who humiliated me over and over again because it was easier than growing a spine?" Mark's mouth opened, but I didn't let him speak. "You watched me shrink in every room we ever entered together," I said, pushing away from the counter and walking toward him slowly. "You watched them dismiss me, mock me, exclude me. And every time you stayed quiet, you gave them permission. Every time you said nothing, you told me I was on my own." He shook his head, but not in denial, just in shame, like he was finally seeing the reflection he'd been avoiding for years. "I didn't think it would get that bad," he murmured. "I thought, maybe if I just kept the peace." "No," I interrupted, sharper now. "You weren't keeping peace. You were choosing comfort. Yours. Theirs. Not mine." I walked past him, toward the hallway, and returned with a plain white envelope, thick and heavy with consequence. I handed it to him without ceremony, and he took it with hesitant fingers, eyes flicking from me to the envelope and back again. "What is this?" he asked, though some part of him already knew. "A postnup," I said plainly. "Every year I spent cooking meals, cleaning up after your family's mess, organizing holidays, making sure your mother didn't rip us apart. I'm putting it in writing now. If I'm just a servant, let's see how much my labor's really worth." He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the envelope like it might explode in his hands. "I'm not asking for a divorce," I continued, voice cool, composed. "Not yet. But I'm done pretending this house is built on love when it's been running on resentment and silence. You want to keep this marriage? Then you'll sign that paper and prove that you know what I've given up for you." Otherwise, we're already done. We just haven't signed the death certificate yet. I walked past him again, slower this time, not because I was angry, but because I wanted him to hear every step I took, every sound of my heels echoing off the hardwood floor like a drumbeat marking the end of something hollow. He didn't follow me. He didn't speak again. He just stood there, holding the envelope like it was heavier than it looked, like it carried the weight of 1,000 moments he wished he could take back. I didn't sleep in our bedroom that night. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't slam a door or pack a suitcase. I simply lay in the guest room, eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the silence that finally belonged to me. And maybe I stayed. Maybe I didn't. Maybe the next morning I woke up and chose a different life entirely, or maybe I waited to see what he would do next, whether he'd fight for me for once or keep hiding behind his mother's skirt. But I'll tell you this, when I left that room, when I walked down that hallway and passed by his stunned silence, I didn't feel rage or regret. Just calm. Just clarity. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. It's just the sound of heels clicking on the floor as you walk away from people who thought you'd never do it.